The sunlight shimmered across the turquoise waters of the Pacific Ocean as the luxurious black convertible snaked along the winding coastal road. Emily Dalton leaned back in her seat, her dark sunglasses reflecting the cliffs and the deep blue horizon beyond. She felt the warm Californian breeze tugging at her hair and allowed herself a rare moment of peace. This was supposed to be her perfect honeymoon, after all. The small coastal town of Monterey, California, was picturesque, quaint streets lined with boutiques and art galleries, the salty air filled with the sound of crashing waves. Emily had always dreamed of a honeymoon like this. The exclusivity of the resort they had chosen made it feel like they had the whole coast to themselves. It was a scene straight out of a postcard, but beneath the surface, something felt off. She glanced at her husband, Ryan, gripping the steering wheel with an intensity that made her uneasy. His jaw was clenched, his knuckles white. Just days earlier, they had stood at the altar, smiling in front of hundreds of guests. He had been perfect that day, the charming, attentive man who had swept her off her feet. But now, here on this lonely stretch of road, she couldn't shake the growing feeling that something was wrong. He had barely spoken since they arrived, his demeanor cold and distant, a stark contrast to the warmth he had shown her in the past. "Are you okay?" Emily finally asked, her voice cutting through the sound of the wind. Ryan blinked, snapping out of whatever thoughts had taken him hostage. "Yeah," he replied, glancing at her briefly. His smile was quick, forced, like a mask. "I'm fine. Just thinking about everything. The wedding, the move. It's a lot." Emily nodded, though she wasn't convinced. There had been small signs, little things she had chosen to ignore before the wedding. The hushed phone calls late at night, the sudden changes in plans, the way Ryan had seemed more and more distracted. She had chalked it up to wedding stress, the whirlwind of events leading up to their big day. But now, on this cliffside road overlooking the ocean, that doubt gnawed at her. "We're almost there," Ryan said, pointing ahead toward the edge of the cliffs where the road met a secluded viewpoint. The idea was to park and take a walk along the rocky trail, enjoying the sunset. It had sounded romantic when Ryan first suggested it, but now Emily's stomach churned with unease. As they pulled into the small parking lot, Ryan stepped out of the car, walking around to Emily's side. He opened the door for her, extending a hand. She took it, but his touch felt colder than it should have. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks below echoed in the distance as they made their way to the cliff's edge. Emily peered down at the vast expanse of water far beneath them. It was beautiful, but there was something terrifying about the height, the power of the ocean stretching endlessly toward the horizon. She turned to Ryan, who stood a few feet away, gazing out at the sunset. "This place is stunning," Emily said, trying to shake off the strange tension between them. "Thank you for bringing me here." Ryan smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. He stepped closer, his gaze hard to read, something lurking just beneath the surface. "I wanted this to be special," he said softly. Emily frowned, sensing the shift in his tone. "It is," she assured him. But even as she said the words, the doubt in her mind grew louder. Then, out of nowhere, Ryan reached for her arm, his grip tight. "Too tight, Ryan." Emily's voice trembled. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes seemed to darken, his expression hardening. The warmth of the honeymoon, the memories of the wedding day, all of it seemed to vanish in that moment as he looked at her with a coldness she had never seen before. He started, but the words never came. Before Emily could react, her heel slipped on the loose gravel near the cliff's edge. She gasped as her body lurched forward, the world tilting beneath her. For a split second, everything seemed to slow down. She saw Ryan's face, his hand still gripping her arm, and then, she was falling. The sensation was terrifying and surreal. The wind whipped through her hair, her body weightless as she plunged toward the jagged rocks below. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw Ryan still standing at the cliff's edge, watching her fall. The icy waters of the Pacific swallowed her whole, the impact sending a shock through her entire body. Darkness closed in around her as she sank beneath the waves, the cold numbing her senses. Her lungs screamed for air, but she couldn't fight the weight pulling her down. She reached out, clawing at nothing, her vision blurring as she lost consciousness. When Emily opened her eyes again, she wasn't dead. Somehow, impossibly, she was alive. Her body ached all over, and the taste of salt water lingered in her mouth. She was lying on a bed of rocks, the tide gently lapping at her feet. Her head throbbed, her vision blurry, but she could make out the distant sound of voices. Panic surged through her. She wasn't supposed to be alive. She had fallen from the cliffs, hadn't she? She should be dead. Emily struggled to sit up, her breath ragged. Then she heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable. It was Ryan. He was still at the top of the cliff. She strained to listen, trying to make out what he was saying. No sign of her, he was telling someone. It was an accident. She fell. Her heart raced. He thought she was dead. He had watched her fall, and now he was lying about it. Emily's mind spun as the truth began to dawn on her. This wasn't an accident. It had never been an accident. Ryan had tried to kill her. Gritting her teeth, Emily made a decision. She would stay hidden, and she would learn the truth. But for now, she would let Ryan believe she was dead. Only then could she figure out how to survive, and get revenge. Cold. That was the first sensation Emily became aware of, an all-consuming, bone-chilling cold that seeped into every inch of her body. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing nothing but a dull gray sky overhead. The sound of crashing waves echoed in her ears, and as she tried to move, pain shot through her limbs, forcing her to wince. She was alive. The realization hit her with a rush of confusion and terror. She had fallen, tumbled from the cliffs like a rag doll into the icy Pacific waters below. She could still feel the sensation of weightlessness as she plunged, the horrifying moment of impact, and the suffocating grip of the ocean as it dragged her under. How could she have survived? Emily coughed, expelling salt water from her lungs as she slowly pushed herself up onto her hands and knees. She was lying on a narrow strip of rocky shore, half hidden beneath the cliffs that loomed above. Waves lapped at her legs, and the sharp, jagged stones beneath her dug into her skin, but the pain was a welcome reminder that she was still breathing. She wasn't sure how long she had been unconscious, or how far the current had carried her, but the important thing was that she had survived. Somehow, against all odds, she had made it out alive. For now. Her head throbbed, and her body ached with every movement, but as she struggled to stand, another realization sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. Ryan. The memory of his face as she fell flashed in her mind, cold, detached, watching her plummet as if it was nothing more than an inconvenience. He had let her fall. No, more than that. He had wanted her to fall. Emily stumbled toward the cliffside, her pulse quickening as she pressed herself into the shadows beneath the rocks. From this vantage point, she could just make out the top of the cliff where she had stood minutes, hours ago. Her heart pounded in her chest as she heard voices from above. Ryan's voice. She strained to listen, her senses still dulled from the fall, but the words were clear enough. No sign of her, Ryan was saying, his tone steady, almost rehearsed. It all happened so fast. She slipped, and I couldn't reach her in time. Emily clenched her fists, the cold air biting at her skin as she processed what he was saying. He was lying. There was no panic, no desperation in his voice. It was calm, calculated. He was talking to someone, police maybe? Whoever it was, he was trying to convince them that her fall had been an accident, that he had nothing to do with it. The realization sent a surge of fury through her. Ryan had planned this. The coldness in his eyes before she fell, the way his hand had gripped her arm just a little too tightly. It was all part of his plan. He had brought her here, to this remote place, away from prying eyes, so he could kill her. Emily's mind raced as she crouched lower, trying to remain hidden from view. She couldn't confront him now. She was in no condition to fight, and if Ryan knew she was alive, he would finish what he started. She had to be smart. She had to stay hidden. As she watched, Ryan moved further away from the edge of the cliff, still talking to whoever was with him. Emily's heart thudded in her chest. This was her chance. She couldn't stay here, not with Ryan so close. She needed to get away, to find shelter, to regroup. She could figure out what to do next once she was safe. With a shaky breath, Emily turned away from the cliffs and began to stumble down the rocky shoreline. Each step sent sharp pains shooting up her legs, and her vision swam as the after-effects of the fall began to catch up with her. But she pushed through it, driven by a single thought: survival. The shoreline was desolate, with jagged rocks jutting out into the ocean and no sign of civilization in sight. The cliffs towered above her, casting long shadows over the narrow beach. She kept to the shadows, her body trembling from the cold and exhaustion as she moved further away from the spot where she had landed. After what felt like an eternity, Emily spotted a small cave nestled into the cliffside. It wasn't much, but it would provide shelter from the elements, and from Ryan. She hurried toward it, wincing with every step, and collapsed inside. The interior of the cave was dark and damp, but at least it offered some protection. Emily sank to the ground, her back against the rough stone wall. Her body ached, her head throbbed, but her mind was racing. Ryan had tried to kill her. There was no doubt about it now. And if she hadn't survived, he would have gotten away with it. But why? What had changed between them? Their wedding had been perfect, hadn't it? The whirlwind romance, the lavish ceremony. Had it all been a lie? She thought back to the small signs, the little things she had ignored in the weeks leading up to the wedding. The secretive phone calls, the sudden trips Ryan had taken, the way he had seemed distracted, distant. Had she been blind to what was really going on? Her thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of sirens. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. They were looking for her. The police, the rescue teams, they were searching for her body. But if they found her alive, if Ryan knew she had survived, he would come after her again. She had no choice. She had to stay dead. Emily's heart pounded as she made her decision. She would hide here in this cave, and let them believe she was gone. It was the only way to buy herself time. Time to figure out what Ryan was really after. Time to find out why he had done this. And time to get her revenge. Emily woke to the sound of waves crashing against the rocks outside her cave. Her body ached in ways she never thought possible. Each breath felt like shards of glass slicing through her chest. The cold was relentless, seeping into her bones, but it was the pain that kept her grounded, reminding her she was still alive. Every muscle screamed in protest as she slowly sat up, her mind trying to process the surreal horror she had narrowly escaped. She had been out there for hours, maybe even days. The only sense of time she had was the fading light outside the cave, the sun dipping below the horizon in a wash of red and orange. Her clothes were still damp, clinging to her bruised skin, and her head pounded from both the fall and the trauma of her discovery. Ryan had tried to kill her. That thought circled through her mind over and over, each time sharper, more real. He had stood on that cliff, watching her plummet, and then lied about it to the authorities. But why? What had she done to deserve this? What did he want? She ran her hands through her wet, tangled hair, trying to calm the storm of thoughts. There was no time for panic. She had to think clearly, had to stay ahead of him. Emily knew she couldn't stay here forever. Sooner or later, someone might find her, and she couldn't risk that, not until she figured out why Ryan had betrayed her. Until then, she had to remain dead in everyone's eyes. She couldn't return to her old life. Not yet. Not until she knew more. Over the next few days, Emily's survival instincts kicked in. She was fortunate enough to find a few washed-up items from the ocean that had drifted near the cave, a bottle of water, a plastic bag, and a raincoat. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get her through the initial shock. When the tide was low, she foraged along the shoreline for anything edible, seaweed, shellfish, anything to keep herself going. She rationed her energy, conserving her strength as best she could, but her mind never stopped racing. At night, she would sit in the cave, shivering under the raincoat and listening to the distant hum of the world she could no longer be a part of. She imagined what was happening outside, beyond the cliffs and the beach. Had the search for her body continued? Was Ryan playing the part of the grieving widower, tearfully telling the authorities how his beloved wife had tragically slipped? The thought made her stomach churn. Emily knew she had to find out what was happening. She needed information. She couldn't stay hidden in this cave forever, surviving on scraps and salt water. If she was going to take control of the situation, she needed to step out of the shadows. But how? On the fourth day, as she crouched by the mouth of the cave, Emily heard something that made her freeze. Voices. At first, they were faint, carried on the wind, but as they grew louder, she could make out the rough tone of a man, speaking in short, gruff sentences. Panic seized her. Was it Ryan? Had he found her? Or was it someone else? Her heart raced as she pressed herself against the cold stone wall, listening intently. The voices drew closer until she could see two figures walking along the beach, a man and a woman. They weren't dressed like tourists. The man wore a weathered jacket and boots caked with mud. The woman was much younger, her arms crossed tightly against the cold, looking out over the ocean with a distant gaze. Emily held her breath as the two passed, her body rigid with fear. She couldn't let them see her. Not yet. But as she watched, the man stopped, pointing toward the rocks not far from her hiding spot. Sam, look, the woman said, her voice soft but audible over the wind. What's that? The man, Sam, crouched down, inspecting something tangled in the rocks. Emily craned her neck, trying to see what had caught his attention. Her breath hitched when she realized it was a piece of fabric from her dress, the same dress she had worn when she fell. The woman looked at Sam, concern clouding her features. "You think it's from that woman they've been searching for? The one who went over the cliffs?" Sam stood, scratching the back of his neck. "Maybe. But no one's found her yet. Tide's been dragging everything out. Could be anything." The woman hesitated, glancing at the cliffs. "It's so sad, isn't it? Dying out here, all alone." The man grunted in response, but Emily could see the doubt in his eyes as he scanned the rocky shoreline. She held her breath, praying they would move on. After what felt like an eternity, they finally did, their voices fading into the distance as they continued walking along the beach. Emily exhaled slowly, her mind racing. She had to be more careful. If people were still searching the area, it wouldn't be long before someone came too close to finding her. But the mention of her name confirmed what she had feared. Ryan's story had spread, and the world believed she was dead. Still, she needed help. And Sam, he didn't seem like one of them. His expression had been skeptical, his tone less rehearsed than Ryan's smooth performance. Maybe, just maybe, she could approach him. Carefully, of course. That night, Emily waited for Sam to return. She had noticed that he and the woman, who she later heard was named Lena, his niece, often walked along the beach at sunset, scanning for debris or fishing along the shore. He seemed like a local, someone who knew the area well. When she spotted him again, walking alone this time, Emily knew it was her chance. Her body trembled with nerves as she stepped out from the shadows of the cave. Her clothes were filthy, her hair a tangled mess, and her body weak from days of near starvation, but she had no other option. "Please," she croaked, her voice weak from lack of use. "Help me." Sam whipped around, his eyes wide in shock as he spotted her emerging from the darkness. His hand instinctively reached for the knife at his belt, but when he saw the state she was in, he froze. "Jesus," he muttered, taking a step back. "What the hell happened to you?" Emily swallowed hard, trying to speak despite her dry throat. "I fell. From the cliffs." Recognition flickered in his eyes. "You're her? The woman from the news?" She nodded, bracing herself for his reaction. He could easily turn her in, alert the authorities, or worse, Ryan. But instead, Sam frowned, his expression hardening with suspicion. "If you're still alive," he said slowly, "why haven't you gone to the police?" Emily's heart pounded as she met his gaze, searching for any sign of trust. "Because I can't. Someone tried to kill me. They're still looking for me." Sam's eyes narrowed, his weathered face unreadable. For a moment, Emily feared he wouldn't believe her, that he would dismiss her as some lunatic washed up from the ocean. But then, to her relief, he nodded slowly. "All right," he said, his voice gruff but steady. "We need to get you out of sight. If anyone finds you here, it'll be trouble." Emily felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. This man, this stranger, was her only hope. She followed him silently as he led her away from the cave, her legs weak but her determination stronger than ever. She wasn't safe yet. But for the first time since her fall, she had an ally. And with his help, she might just be able to unravel the mystery behind Ryan's betrayal, and take back her life. Emily sat in the dimly lit corner of Sam's weathered fishing shack, wrapped in an old wool blanket he had given her. The warmth was a welcome contrast to the relentless cold she had endured for days, but her mind remained far from at ease. She had survived the fall, escaped detection, but the biggest question still hung over her like a storm cloud. Why had Ryan tried to kill her? Her hands shook as she lifted a cup of steaming tea to her lips. The bitterness lingered on her tongue, but she forced it down, grateful for anything that brought life back into her tired, broken body. Sam moved around the small, cluttered space, his face a mask of quiet concentration. Since the night she had revealed herself to him, he had been helpful but cautious. He hadn't asked many questions, at least not yet, but Emily knew it was only a matter of time before he demanded answers. "You don't look like someone who's been washed up on shore for days," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was rough, but not unkind. "You look like someone running from something, or someone." Emily lowered the cup and met his gaze. She could see the skepticism in his eyes, the flicker of doubt that told her he was still weighing whether or not to believe her story. She couldn't blame him. If their roles were reversed, she would have been equally suspicious. "I told you the truth," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. My husband, Ryan. He tried to kill me. Sam crossed his arms, leaning back against the wall, studying her closely. You're saying he pushed you off the cliffs? No, she replied, shaking her head. Not exactly. I slipped, but he didn't try to save me. He just watched. And I've been putting the pieces together ever since. The silence stretched between them as Sam's eyes narrowed. He didn't speak, but Emily could tell he wanted more. She hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal, but she knew she couldn't stay vague forever. If she was going to trust Sam, she had to tell him the full story, or at least, as much as she understood. It didn't make sense at first, Emily continued, setting the cup down on the table beside her. We had the perfect wedding, the perfect life, or so I thought. But there were things that didn't add up. Strange phone calls, meetings he didn't explain, and lately, he'd become distant, cold. I convinced myself it was just stress from the wedding, but now I think it was something else. Sam watched her carefully. Something like what? Money, Emily said, the word bitter in her mouth. He took out a massive life insurance policy on me just weeks before the wedding. I didn't know about it until after the fall, when I started piecing things together. It wasn't an accident. It was a plan. Sam raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything, waiting for her to continue. And he wasn't acting alone, Emily added, her voice dropping to a whisper. She had been turning this theory over in her mind for days, and the more she thought about it, the more certain she became. I think my best friend Hannah is involved. Sam let out a low whistle. Your best friend? What makes you think that? Emily swallowed hard, remembering the countless times Hannah had been by her side, planning the wedding, reassuring her when things felt off, always there with a kind word or a supportive gesture. It all seemed so genuine at the time. But in the days leading up to the wedding, there had been too many moments where Hannah and Ryan had exchanged looks that made her uneasy. She had chalked it up to stress, but now those moments felt like something more. I overheard them talking once, Emily admitted, her voice tight with the memory. It was late, after one of the wedding planning sessions. They were close, too close. I didn't want to believe it, but now I think they'd been working together this whole time. Sam didn't respond immediately, but she could see the gears turning in his mind. He uncrossed his arms and walked over to the small stove in the corner of the shack, stirring the pot that simmered on top. So what's your plan? He asked finally, turning back to her. You can't stay hidden forever. Emily clenched her fists under the blanket. He was right. She couldn't hide here indefinitely, as much as the thought of facing Ryan and Hannah again terrified her. She needed more information, needed to understand the full scope of their betrayal before she could act. But where would she even begin? Sam studied her for a moment, then seemed to make a decision. I know people in this town, he said, his voice low and measured. People who can find things out. If your husband's involved in something shady, it's bound to leave a trail. You need proof, right? Something solid. Emily's heart leaped with hope. You'd do that for me? I'm not doing it for free, Sam said, though there was a hint of a smile on his lips. But I don't like the idea of someone getting away with murder either. Emily let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She had an ally, someone who could help her uncover the truth and gather the evidence she needed to expose Ryan and Hannah. But as the relief washed over her, a new thought crept in, one that made her skin crawl. If Ryan and Hannah realized she was alive, they wouldn't stop until they finished what they had started. Meanwhile, back in town, Ryan stood in front of the mirror in their hotel suite, adjusting his tie. The reflection staring back at him was that of a grieving husband, his eyes red, his expression distant. He had perfected this look over the past few days, making sure everyone believed his story. Emily had fallen, and there had been nothing he could do to save her. His heart pounded with anticipation. The life insurance claim had already been filed, and the money, millions, would be processed soon. The only loose end was Hannah, who had grown increasingly anxious since the accident. Ryan turned away from the mirror and reached for his phone. He had promised Hannah it would be over quickly, that no one would question the accident. But Emily's body still hadn't been found, and that was enough to make anyone nervous. He dialed Hannah's number, pacing as the phone rang. When she answered, her voice was shaky. Ryan, are you sure about this? They haven't found her yet. What if? She's gone. Ryan cut her off, his voice cold. Even if they find the body, no one will suspect a thing. We just need to stick to the plan. There was a pause on the other end. And what if they don't find her body? What then? Ryan's jaw clenched. Then we make sure no one ever finds her. The storm clouds rolled in over Monterey, casting an eerie darkness over the cliffs where it had all begun. The once beautiful coastline now felt like the scene of a nightmare. For Emily, it was a fitting backdrop for what was about to unfold. She stood at the edge of the same cliffs she had fallen from days ago, hidden behind a thicket of rocks and wild shrubs, watching as a small crowd gathered near the memorial. The flowers, candles, and framed pictures were all in her honor, a tribute to the loving wife who had tragically fallen to her death. Ryan was front and center, his expression stoic, his arm wrapped around Hannah as they played their parts for the few mourners who had shown up. Emily's blood boiled as she watched them. They didn't look guilty. They didn't look afraid. They looked like they had already won. But they had no idea she was still here. Sam had done his part well. Over the past few days, he had dug deep into Ryan's life, uncovering a series of financial transactions and emails between him and Hannah that painted a clear picture of their conspiracy. The life insurance policy, the hidden bank accounts, the secret meetings, everything pointed to a premeditated plan to kill Emily and cash in on her fortune. It was enough evidence to bury them both. Now, it was time for Emily to finish this. As the memorial service continued, Ryan took a step forward, his face somber as he addressed the small crowd. "I can't express how much I've lost," he said, his voice trembling. "Emily was my life. She was the love of my life, and I'll never be the same without her." Emily's stomach twisted at the sound of his voice. The audacity of him standing there, lying to the people who had come to mourn her. He sounded so sincere, so convincing, but she knew the truth. And now, so would everyone else. From her hiding spot, Emily nodded at Sam, who was positioned near the back of the crowd. He slipped a hand into his jacket, pulling out his phone. With a few quick taps, he uploaded the files they had collected, the emails, the bank statements, the damning evidence, straight to the cloud. He had sent copies to the local police chief, several journalists, and even the guests who were standing at the memorial now. Ryan's betrayal was about to become public knowledge. Emily watched as the phones in the crowd began to buzz and light up. Murmurs spread through the mourners as they glanced at their screens. Confusion turned to shock, and then to anger. Ryan noticed it too. His gaze shifted nervously, his confident facade starting to crack as the people around him began whispering. "What's going on?" Hannah asked, her voice rising with panic. Ryan fumbled with his own phone, his face paling as he scrolled through the flood of messages and notifications. His mouth fell open in disbelief. This isn't true," he stammered, looking around at the crowd. It's all lies." But it was too late. The truth was out. Emily stepped out from behind the rocks, her heart pounding as she made her way toward the memorial. The wind whipped through her hair, her body still bruised and weak from the fall, but she stood tall, her eyes fixed on Ryan. When he saw her, his face drained of color. "Emily," he gasped, stumbling back as if he were seeing a ghost. The crowd parted, their eyes wide with shock as they realized who she was. Gasps echoed through the air, and all eyes were on Emily now. Ryan's carefully crafted lie was crumbling before him, and there was no way out. "I'm not dead, Ryan," Emily said, her voice cold and steady. "But you wanted me to be, didn't you?" Hannah's face twisted in horror, and she took a step back, her eyes darting between Emily and Ryan. "What is she talking about?" she demanded, her voice shrill. Ryan's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He looked around desperately, as if searching for a way to explain, to deny the undeniable, but there was no escape. Everyone had seen the evidence. Everyone knew the truth. Emily stepped closer, her heart racing. She could see the panic in Ryan's eyes, the fear that he had lost everything. The life he had carefully built with lies and deceit was falling apart right in front of him. "You tried to kill me," Emily continued, her voice rising with each word. "You and Hannah planned this. You thought you could get away with it. But now everyone knows who you really are." The police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as they neared the cliffside. Ryan's face contorted in desperation, and for a moment, Emily thought he might run. But there was nowhere to go. The crowd, the evidence, the police, all of it was closing in on him. Ryan turned to Hannah, his voice frantic. "We need to go. Now." But Hannah wasn't listening. Her eyes were wide with terror as she backed away from Ryan, shaking her head. "I didn't know," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know it would go this far." Ryan grabbed her arm, pulling her close, but Hannah yanked herself free, tears streaming down her face. "You said it would be easy," she screamed. "You said no one would ever find out." The police cars screeched to a halt just beyond the crowd, and officers poured out, guns drawn as they surrounded Ryan and Hannah. Ryan's face twisted with rage as he looked back at Emily, his eyes full of hatred. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice venomous. "I'll..." Before he could finish, the officers tackled him to the ground, pinning his arms behind his back as they cuffed him. Hannah sobbed uncontrollably, her knees buckling as the officers moved in to arrest her as well. The crowd looked on in stunned silence as the two were dragged away, their lives in ruins. Emily watched them go, her heart pounding in her chest. It was over. The nightmare that had consumed her life, the betrayal, the lies, everything was finally over. She felt the weight of it lift from her shoulders, and for the first time in days, she could breathe. Sam walked up beside her, nodding in approval. "You did it," he said quietly. "You got your justice." Emily nodded, her eyes never leaving Ryan as he was shoved into the back of the police car. "We did it," she corrected, giving him a small, grateful smile. The crowd began to disperse, the weight of the revelation still sinking in. Emily stood there for a long moment, taking in the scene, the closure that she had desperately needed. She had survived. She had won. And now, she could finally move forward. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, leave a comment below with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on future content. Your support means everything to us, and it really helps the channel grow. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.